Hello, welcome to the IJAP session on socially just net zero transitions in Asia. I'm So Young, a senior researcher here at IGS and an organizer and moderator of the session. I'm very pleased to lead you through the session today. Before we jump into the presentation with speakers, let me briefly introduce you how this session has been initiated and organized. Let me begin with the background idea. Many of us agree that the speedy transition from fossil fuels to renewables is a positive step when we consider climate crisis and its impact on both the environment and human society. At the same time, however, such a transition should require global and domestic policies and actions to be not only more environmentally sustainable, but also socially just. Especially when the Asian context is considered, there should be a transformation with a long-term and holistic perspective to avoid recurrent climate injustice that could possibly leave the currently disadvantaged further behind. With that idea, from early this year, papers have been collected and submitted to the Sustainability Science Journal that IGS hosts on the topic of just and sustainable transitions in net zero Asia for the special feature of the journal. And that special feature will be out next summer. So actually this special feature itself has yet been published, but please audience, access and visit the journal and download papers there, as the sustainability science already has full of related quality transdisciplinary articles there. In today's session, 3 authors of that forthcoming special feature will share their findings. The first one, informing China's approach to a just transition, will be presented by Dr. Sharma at the University of Queensland. And the second speaker, Dr. Watabe at IGS, will present on making sense of sustainability through civic engagement in urban food production. And next will be Dr. Che at Chungang University and covers climate justice beyond intergenerational conflict. And after the presentation, Ms. Helena Norberg-Hoch, Director of Local Futures, will lead the discussion. Before getting started, let you know again that if you have questions, please drop those into the Q&A at the bottom. Then speakers will respond, and we will also try to answer them at the discussion. Now, let's begin with the first presenter, Dr. Vijaya Sharma, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Queensland. She has years of experience in applied research across domestic and international mining and energy sectors, and she is leading the projects on fossil fuel transitions in India, China, and Australia. Dr. Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thanks, So Young. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm just waiting for my slides to be shared, please. Perfect, thank you. So yes, my talk today is going to be based on a project that we've recently concluded, which looked at China's approach to a just transition and what lessons could potentially from other regions inform how China approaches the policymaking and policy design around just transition. Next slide, please. So just briefly, I'm going to introduce you and give a little bit of a background context to China's coal landscape and introduce the concept of just transitions, particularly our take on it, and then draw lessons from experiences in other regions and bring it all together with some pointers for policy guidance and lessons for China. Next slide, please. So obviously, I don't have to overstate it, but the world really doesn't underestimate and should not underestimate the centrality and enormity of coal transition challenge in China. China's economy remains highly dependent on coal, accounting for up to 70% of the energy production, 45% of which is primarily used in the industrial sector and the rest to generate power. China also hosts the world's largest number of coal-fired power stations, over 1,000 units, and more than 10,000 operating coal mines currently exist in China. In 2021, China's output, coal output of 4 billion tons accounted for more than 50% of the world's total. Next slide, please. There are presently a range of techno-economic, ecological, and institutional incentives already in place in China that support energy transition. The main feature of China's approach to a transition out of coal is what the government has agreed on, a middle way, which is really trying to find that sweet spot between progressive climate goals and energy and security priorities. So in that sense, it is very much an orderly, planned, and supervised transition that ensures that China doesn't have to compromise on meeting its rising energy demands, job security, but also maintaining social stability, which is obviously a key priority for the government in China. Next slide, please. So just transition, as many of you already here would know, as a concept is not new at all. It first emerged in the 1970s and was driven primarily by labor union movements and environmental justice groups. It has achieved, although in the last decade, a renewed focus for the aspiration it promotes as the world plans its energy transition. So building on the principles of energy, environmental, and climate justice, it was formally adopted in 2018 by the signing of the Solidarity and Just Transition Silesia Declaration in Poland. It emphasizes a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs as critical to an effective and inclusive transition to a low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. There is policy and financing initiatives, examples being the EU Just Transition Mechanism and the World Bank's Just Transition for All initiative, which are currently driving a lot of the conversation globally around pathways towards that transition, which is pathways towards a transition that is fair and equitable around the world. Next slide, please. So one of the things we began to do in this project before we got to understanding, well, what have other regions done, was to look internally in China and look at mapping or unpacking its dependencies on coal in a number of ways. So as this image on the left shows, there are dependencies across the entire value chain in China. So steel industry, for example, illustrates coal dependencies across critical industries. China is the world's largest steel producer at the moment. Coal phase out, we anticipate, will create disruption that will in turn influence national and global steel supply chains. Knock-on effects may include impediments to national rural revitalization agenda, which is also a priority agenda for the government in the latest 5-year plan, weakening of some of those rural-urban linkages, and further socioeconomic disadvantage for communities and businesses, small and medium, that support steelmaking hubs. So we looked at not only coal production and coal mine sites and assets, but also all the way through to the downstream activities such as steel industry, through looking at transportation sector as a whole, but also specifically around railways and waterways and trucks. The figure on the right, as you see, is just the top 10 steelmaking provinces in China. And as you can see, it's quite localized in China's east and sort of north and northeast. Next slide, please. The other reason why China's coal dependencies are so critical is obviously because of the social and cultural identities that are tied with coal. So 3.5 million workers is a guesstimate at best. There is a certain element of data opacity in China. So this is the best guess we came up with, based, informed guess, I would like to say. But this number could be almost double or further or much more than 3.5. So based on social identities, China has a certain sense of, Chinese communities have a certain sense of pride and status associated with coal. There is place attachment, and as we have seen in other parts of the developed world, where strong identities with extraction industries are quite difficult to unpack. So on the right, you see what we've drawn from a paper that was recently, academic paper that was published last year, which looks at some low-hanging fruits, which is out of the 1,000+ active coal plants, about 186 could be turned off pretty soon based on technical, economic, and environmental performances. However, what is missing in that assessment is really what happens on the ground, what happens to the social and cultural fabric of those communities where those coal plants, thermal plants might be switched off. So without understanding or undertaking a social due diligence assessment, these retirements may cause unforeseen social impacts. And I think that's where our project provides a novel assessment of what some of those social impacts might be. Next slide, please. So in order to look at what China can draw and how it can draw on other global regions, we looked at energy transition experiences from 6 countries to identify lessons for managing the social aspects of China's coal transition over the next few decades. I'm going to only list some relevance for China from 2 of those experiences, namely Germany and the United States, just for lack of time. Next slide, please. So German coal transition is very well documented. Its famous Commission on Growth, Structural Change and Employment, popularly known as the Coal Commission, offers a really good example of stakeholder engagement, dialogue, and policy level commitment. Its scope included developing strategies to not only ensure economic development, but also social compatibility and cohesion and climate protection, as well as identifying fiscal measures to support large-scale industrial structural change in coal regions and dependent communities. Next slide, please. So, what has Germany done well? A number of things. It has, first of all, looked at considering long-term impacts. It also looked at establishing synergies among key policy goals, focus on soft location factors and infrastructure development through a focus on innovation, research and development in coal regions, and a strong funding commitment by the federal agencies. Next slide, please. Germany's lessons are quite relevant for China because to some extent, Germany also had a controlled and a planned coal phase out, particularly for hard coal. Its focus on inclusion, not exclusion, ties in really strongly with China's own focus on social cohesion and a government-wide agenda on avoiding projects and activities that may cause social disruption at scale. There was also policy level commitment from national through to local governments, which offer a really good example also for China to be able to create a combination of its command and control governance mechanism with market-based and greater inclusion of private sector and the industry with civil society organizations and building capability within those organizations. Next slide, please. Coming to the US experience. So as you know, 22 out of 50 states in the US are considered main coal regions. Appalachia is a particular region which covers 8 states, over 25 million people. This was really quite large compared to if you look at the Ruhr region in Germany, which was only 1/5 of the population. The interesting bit in the US that we found that obviously is, sorry, an influential coal lobby, which has deep political roots. Next slide, please. So this is just a map of the Appalachia region. And just to also reinstate that coal production experienced quite a steady decline starting from 1985 with mine closures and an overall decline of the coal industry. Studies report relative and absolute declines starting right back from the 1980s. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Vigya, to stop you there. I think you should wrap up.
Yes, okay. Right, so if I could jump one more slide, please. And one more. So these are some of the, oh, no, sorry, one slide back, please. Yeah, so these are some global lessons that we believe can help in terms of providing some strategic pointers to guide China's just transition. Adaptation to context came over and over through all of the other experiences that each region, each local town, community, and government will require its own context-specific transition strategy. Engagement and dialogue with those affected, particularly around inclusion, not exclusion, identifying gatekeepers, which can be both administrative and community orientated in nature. Building bottom-up capability and agency is really another important part. Commitment from the government, we found, was really instrumental in Germany, for example, where there was not only financial commitment, but also a commitment along a timeline. Proactive planning helped with that timeline, of course. Next slide, please. And just finally, so these are some recommendations. We believe aligning energy transition policy with key national priorities is important. In the case of China, 5-year plans that guide these priorities offer a credible anchor to plan and implement coal transition pathways. Focus on regional and sub-regional planning is obviously important. Communities in the line of direct impacts must be directly engaged in policy design. Transition policy should be able to identify and engage stakeholders early, methodically identify local strengths, and foster integrated consensus-driven approach to map and assess social impacts across scale. So obviously China has its own unique administrative and governance arrangement, and there is perhaps a way to create some China-sensitive approach to engaging stakeholders. Value-based approaches to diversification, we found it was also critical to recognize particularly at-risk groups and counter existing disadvantage. Localized approaches to just transition, particularly around building provincial and local government capacities, will need support in China because those are also the areas that are currently weakest, in our opinion. And then finally, a China-sensitive transitions thinking model, which, for example, government agencies such as the NDRC, which is the National Development Reform Commission, are really important in extending this thinking. Regions should embrace a broad-based development vision that focuses beyond jobs and reskilling. And the focus on land cannot be overstated. Ecological integrity plays an absolutely critical role in shaping social sustainability outcomes. So adequate government support for mined land rehabilitation and regulatory incentives for environmental restoration will really prevent social conflict and increase opportunities for economic diversification. With that, I think I'm done. So Young, thank you.
Thanks, Vigya, for your comprehensive presentation about China's coal phase-out pathways with its specific socio-cultural and institutional context to just transitions. And then the global experience you shared of coal phase-out was very useful to understand China case. Thank you. And then let's come back to you at the discussion session. Now, let me invite our next speaker, Dr. Atsushi Watabe, Program Director of Sustainable Consumption and Production Area at IGS. He has expertise in sociology of rural development and has been leading the UN 10-year framework for sustainable consumption and production. Dr. Watabe, now you have the floor.
Thank you very much. See my slide on screen. I appreciate Dr. Sharma's presentation because she nicely introduced how the diversity of concept and issues covered in this just transition issues, and this helps a lot my discussion. But my presentation title is Making Sense of Unsustainability Through Civic Engagement. So what I'm going to discuss is somehow different from the ordinary discussion of just transition, but I hope this can add something, some value to their debate. So next, please. So as Dr. Sharma introduced, justice issues cover quite many important questions, such as their distribution of benefits and costs, opportunities, and risks associated with the transition. And recently, the just transition matters stretched from energy to other sectors like food transition, transportation, housing, health, and so on. And the fair equitable distribution is just one aspect of just transition, because just transition also covers the issues of the fair participation in the decision-making process, agenda setting, and actions, and so on. And besides, I would also like to argue that how societies or actors consider something as a justice issue itself is a justice issue. So let me start with the rough picture of the food systems transition, which I'm concerned. Global food systems have increased its production throughout the half century, which is exceeding the pace of population growth. Next, please. Sorry, please go to next, please. Next slide, and next, please. And next, please. Yes, and then, however, next slide, please. Yes, yes. So this success in the production growth led to the gradual reduction of the percentage of people undernourished. However, some of the recent events have put this percentage up again. Next, please. This is associated with the fluctuating price of food and energy and so on. So both producers, including smallholders, and consumers with unstable income face risks of securing sufficient food. Next, please. In addition, food systems are considered the major source of global environmental risks, which emits greenhouse gas using most of fresh water and land and causing pollution. Next, please. Finally, in spite of the growth of the food production, malnutrition, which covers both undernourishment and overweight, remain in the world. Next, please. Thus, in short, food systems transitions encompasses the triple challenges of ensuring food security and nutrition, supporting livelihoods, and doing so in an environmentally sustainable manner. Next, please. These are already very complicated challenges. However, what makes these challenges more complicated is the dynamics of the issues or necessities for changes, which evolves and changes over time, depending on the other socioeconomic context. I will take an example from the urban farming areas in Japan. Next, please. Urban farm areas occupy a very small fraction in terms of farm households coverage and value sales in Japanese agricultural sector. However, it has been hotly debated throughout the late 20th century. Next, please. In the context of the rapid economic growth of Japan and the increasing pressures from the foreign government to liberalize the consumer market of Japan, Japanese government tried to accelerate the land use change from farm areas to commercial or housing zones. However, agricultural organizations and some local governments have strongly opposed to the policy and developed the idea of multifunction of the urban farmland to justify their protection. Multifunctions include, for example, improving the urban living environment, environment education, disaster risk reduction, and opportunities for urban citizens to feel nature. Since the 1990s, the pressures of land use change have been relaxed due to the collapse of the bubble economy of Japan and started depopulation. Both national and local governments now appreciate the multifunctions of urban farmlands and encouraged citizens and private sector to collaborate with farmers to protect the farming activities in urban areas. Next, please. And this shows the development of farm areas accepting civic participation as the diverse income source for the farmers. Next, please. Well, this is the changing issues about urban farming area. It's just one case of how topics or issues of unfairness or inappropriateness of food production, food consumption, or use of resources related to food production evolve in the historical context. Next, please. With such recognition, I would like to argue that the dynamic shaping of the transition issues, which includes their meaning of unsustainable or unfair or inappropriate patterns, derive not only from the political negotiations, which I introduced earlier, but also from the interaction and mutual learning among actors with different knowledge and skills. Next, please. Well, I have been interested in how do societal actors make sense of unsustainability or non-resilience about food production and consumption. Next, please. And today I am going to introduce one case from the city of Yokohama. Yokohama is one of the largest cities in Japan, and it's also known as the supporter for urban farming since early years. Yokohama's farming sector have faced many challenges, such as aging of producers and decreasing incomes. But there are many activities keep farm activities through collaborating with educational sector, private business, and non-governmental organizations, including citizens groups. Next, please. Sorry, again, next, please. And next, please. Here comes some pictures. Yes. I have participated in one of such activities where citizens can collaborate with farmers. A small paddy area is used to welcome citizens to practice traditional rice growing activities, which is supported by the farmers and farm volunteers. They do not just come in the planting or harvesting seasons. They do almost every steps throughout the year and engage in traditional seasonal events, including some religious events at the farm. So in other words, they are simulating the classic engagement with the farmer and the local society. Next, please. The farmer says that he wants to share the sense that farming involves the entire local community, which is different from the other occupations. And he wants participating citizens to consider the meaning of having paddies here in the city. Next, please. And next, please. Yes, participants and volunteer members also reflect on how they changed their understanding of food production or farm activities or local environment through their engagement. They highlight the difference between knowledge gained through experience and that learned in the classroom. And they also appreciate that cross-generational exchanges and collaboration, which is usually not possible in the other occasion of the society, like workplaces or classrooms. So there are some key points of reflections through their engagement in the physical activities at the farm. They understand that their previous patterns of food consumption or their previous engagement with their local environment have something definitely wrong. And by revisiting their ways of consumption or daily life, they reaffirm that the values of the farming and the farmland should be protected through the collaboration, and appreciate that this exchange have enabled themselves to grow their capacities and thoughts. So in summary, I would like to emphasize that when we consider justice issues, we often justice, but we could also think of how societal actors can generate and change the ideas about what is justice, what is appropriate, or what is fair. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Presentation. Your presentation on food system transition really broadened the scope of just transition approach, and your emphasis on citizens' engagement in a transition process is truly essential element for the socially just net zero transitions in Asia. Thanks again. Now let's move to last but not least, presenter Dr. Choi Gyu-yeon. She's research professor at DART Center for German and European Studies at Jung-Ang University. And she has conducted researches on youth climate activism, energy transition discourses of Republic of Korea, and renewable energy policy analysis of China. Dr. Choi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for having me here. I'm very delighted to present my research with such an esteemed audience. Because of the time, I just jump into the question, my research. So studies on the Fridays for Future movement were centered around the framing of climate change as an intergenerational problem. The stereotypical dichotomy describes younger generations as the victims of climate change and older generations as the perpetrators who are accused of being reluctant to adopt climate policies and insist on pursuing ecologically harmful lifestyle. This approach depicts future generations of activists as rebellious and confrontational, emphasizing their focus on the interests and benefits of future generations. My study, in contrast, shed light on the youth climate activist inclusive approach to climate justice. School strike groups around the world draw attention to questions of social justice, speaking for groups at heightened exposure to climate disasters due to their low socioeconomic status and limited access to various resources. In particular, Korean youth climate activists put social justice at the forefront of their movement. In South Korea, the FFF movement began in 2019. Large-scale street demonstrations with about 300 to 700 school strikers took place in the center of Seoul during 2019. The young climate activists founded an independent organization, Youth for Climate Action, Y4CA, to continue their political campaigns. Three features are significant in their movement. First, they avoid conflict with older generations. They distance themselves from outright confrontation with older generations. Secondly, they frequently express opposition to the title Future Generations. And thirdly, they ally with socially marginalized groups. For example, they band together with the delivery riders unions, tenant rights groups, and aid organizations for the poor, rather than align with other youth-led advocacy groups. So I conducted research on these three questions. And addressing these questions, I aimed to disclose conceptual structures of climate justice and inherent links between distinct justice concepts. To explore the variety of justice claims, I classify three dimensions of climate justice: intergenerational inequality, historical responsibility, and critical climate justice. Intergenerational justice was the initial ethical idea that gave rise to the paradigm of climate justice. We all know well about the Brundtland report. But the practical implications of the principle can be summarized by the distributive and procedural dimensions. First, the distributive justice between generations refers to a fair, and just allocation of resources across all generations. And the Friday for Future movement puts forward a material conflict between the existing younger and older generations. And secondly, the procedural dimension of intergenerational inequality or justice requires including the interest and opinions of future generations in the decision-making processes for climate politics. I can clarify or elaborate on these concepts, but I think it requires too much time, and I expect our audience know well about these concepts. Historical responsibility. The second dimension concerns the differential responsibility of developed and developing countries. It points to the historical responsibility of or higher responsibility of industrialized countries, but it also includes certain justification of developing countries' emissions for the sake of subsistence and improvement of essential living standard. The third concept is critical climate justice. Since the 2000s, climate movements have notably developed a progressive discourse on climate justice. The justice discourses put forward critical climate justice or transformative climate justice. These three concepts present the different dimensions of inequality which climate justice seeks to address. My empirical research examines the generational consciousness of Korean school strikers to analyze their understanding of climate justice. The qualitative study is based on in-depth interviews with young activists and their publicly expressed opinions. Drawing on critical discourse analysis, my analysis aims to reveal the social structural background of the movement and the motive behind their advocacy of climate justice. Now I will move us on to the findings. I organized my findings with respect to the previously mentioned three questions. My answer to the first question on the reluctance to antagonize older generation is impact of a historical context. Korean youth climate activists have expressed their sympathy for older generations. They say that they understand the way older generations think and understand the world. According to my analysis for school strikers, the past denotes the period of extreme poverty and rapid economic growth during the 1970s and 80s in South Korea. Older generations signify those who made sacrifice and worked hard for the historical economic development of South Korea. Moreover, the youth climate activists acknowledge that they are the beneficiaries of the economic prosperities that was achieved by older generations, accepting that they are also indirect perpetrators, and this blurs the boundaries between the victim and perpetrators dichotomy that underpins ideas of intergenerational inequality. So, in other words, the historical development of the Korean economy complicates the simple notion of distributive inequality between generations, and the school strikers' willingness to accept older generations' mindset evoke parallel to the concept of climate justice between developed and developing countries. So the concept of a historical responsibility. because this approach suggests a form of tolerance toward underdeveloped countries' use of carbon resources to escape poverty. In a similar fashion, Korean youth climate activists view older generations' industrial activity, which took place without any concern for environmental degradation, and their prioritization of growth over green values as legitimate and justifiable. So this case of Korea illustrates how the rhetoric of intergenerational inequality is less easily applied to countries which has become industrialized in the recent past. The claim of justice for historical responsibility countervails the claim for justice between older and younger generations. This suggests that the different frames of climate justice come into conflict when the dividing lines between victims and perpetrators become blurred.
Dr. Che, very sorry to stopping you there, but we are running out of time. So could you please wrap up, please?
Okay. Second question was why do you have ambivalent stance toward the term future generation? And this is because the older generation have a very strong prejudice toward the youth. So they practically saying if older generation call them future generation, that is aimed to exclude them from the present political decision-making process. They feel they are excluded from the political arena when they called future generations. And the second finding is that so the reason why they ally with the social marginalized group is that because of this experience of injustice, so they keep experience kind of a political exclusion, and this experience of injustice led them to reconsider how political power is allocated in South Korea and turn their attention to other socially marginalized group, and they developed a strong sense of solidarity with other socially marginalized group. And so this would ultimately bring youth climate activists to think through the prism of critical climate justice. So this last part shows that the experience of injustice facilitates multiple modes of alliance in the fight against global warming. So my 2 points is that the different concepts of climate justice could come into conflict, as my first finding illustrates, and but climate justice has a potential of expansion when people experience a certain injustice, and this that can open their eyes on the other socially marginalized group, and this channels or facilitates the multiple mode of alliance in the fight of climate change. Thank you for your attention. Yeah. And I'm expecting your feedbacks and questions. So thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation. Your empirical analysis goes really truly beyond the prototype argument on intergenerational climate conflicts between current and next generation. So I personally has lots of questions, but we are running out of time. So thank you, Dr. Che, again. Now we are coming to the discussion part. Let's invite Helena, a famous decades-long activist on localization, eco-village transition town movement, author of best-selling book, Ancient Future, based on her life in Ladakh, and producer of the award-winning documentary, Economics of Happiness. Helena, thanks for joining us today, and please share your insights on how these findings could fit into and or be useful to the actions on the ground, and please feel free to raise questions to speakers. Please, Helena.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that I need to talk about the bigger picture in all of this, and that can be quite threatening for many people, but I am so convinced today that we need to see the bigger picture, to see where the most dramatic and frightening injustice is taking place. And it has to do with the relationship between global corporations and banks and national governments. We're losing democracy and we're losing the right to look at how we could genuinely rapidly move towards much healthier, much more sustainable economies. But first, I want to say how much I appreciate all of you young people who've done this very valid and very important research, and in such a thorough way and so well presented. And I also want to commend So Young for the work that she's doing and has been doing for so long. But I believe that this work will not result in meaningful change unless we step back to look at the bigger picture. And we must try to find fora to do that. And I think what's happening is that the way that global corporations and banks have gained so much power has been because of the assumption that global trade is always a benefit. And this means that in virtually every country in the recent era, governments have opened up their doors to allow global corporations and banks complete freedom, no regulations. And this is how China was essentially opened up and shaped by foreign corporations that turned China into a sort of factory for the rest of the world. And India and Indonesia, Mexico, there was a process over the last 35 years where so-called poor countries where big industry went to produce at a much lower rate and then export to the more industrialized countries. And this is an ideal way for global corporations to earn a lot of money, but it destroys small, medium, and even national industries have been destroyed. And really, when you look at it holistically, it's not in the interest of Ladakh, Bhutan, Sweden, or China, or America. In America right now, people are desperate because in the Southwest, they are using hundreds and thousands of acres of land and subsidized water to grow alfalfa for animals, for cattle in the Middle East. And people are now beginning to say, we're exporting our water. Actually, what we're exporting is our water, and we are running out of water. So people don't have enough water to drink, and they don't have enough water to feed their own animals. So it's so important that we now step back and look at this without blaming any particular government, any particular corporation, any particular human being, because it's really a system that's been escalating for a long time. And I am convinced that the main reason why we're not talking about it is because most people are not seeing it. And we're not seeing it because in the media and in academia, in virtually every avenue of knowledge, the funding has come more and more from these giant banks and corporations, and not because they're evil people, but they're not looking at themselves. They're looking at the world, and they see problems. They see the need for sustainability. They now see the need for justice. They see that the gap between rich and poor in every country is widening. And this is a disaster. And now we're seeing a discussion, from Korea about the gap between the younger generation, the older generation. We're seeing everywhere this frightening analysis of the divides and the divisions, whether it's between vegan people and non-vegan people, whether it's between rich and poor, whether it's between male and female, whether you can even talk about male and female now, because the boundaries and the divisions and the fight for some kind of justice and voice and right has become so diminished. And as people are more and more desperate, they're standing up, of course, for their cause, completely understandably. But we really, really all would recognize if we could step back and look at the bigger picture, that all of humanity is at risk, that we're not now just talking about a system that is decimating the natural world. We're talking about this divisiveness that's growing at every level. And we're talking about algorithms that help to push this divisiveness, because for the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations and banks, that makes more money. But it isn't some evil group of people sitting in a dark room conspiring to destroy the world. So there's really the blindness at the grassroots, blindness at the top, blind governments who, without knowing it, by supporting more global trade, have actually supported their own impoverishment. Governments have become poor enough to go to big business and say, can we please have PPP, public-private partnership, because we can't afford anymore to build the infrastructure, but let's do it together. And the infrastructure they're building is for giant corporations to become even richer. And I'm probably getting close to the end of my time, but I want you to please be aware that right now, an even bigger threat than globalization itself is that because global corporations and banks have gained so much power in the last 35 years. And by the way, I want you to be aware that almost every crisis we face in terms of poverty, in terms of ill health, physical health, in terms of mental health, epidemics of depression, epidemics of suicide among young people. I'm not dramatizing. The truth is that in every single country, these statistics are alarming. And the increase of all these negative trends is clear if you look at it. But we are not looking at that holistically, and we're not looking at the link between that and what's happened in the economy. And in the economy, the pressures on young people to try desperately to study more and more and more, to try to get a decent job in the big city, to be perfectly mobile, to be moving all over the world if needed, all of that is contributing to both physical and mental illness. Why is this happening? As I say again, mainly because we have not been looking at it. We've been caught in an older story about left and right, the idea that either it's going to be communism or social or capitalism or something in between, socialism. What I am talking about is the wake up, where we will see that the real dichotomy is between global and local. But in that global madness that's been happening in the last 35 years, driving up all of these problems, these corporations and banks have so much power, and they are moving towards a metaverse. They are moving into a world where humans will not be needed. I know it sounds dramatic, but if you look, you will see the signs and the propaganda for robots, the propaganda that robots are more compassionate, are more wise, are more, of course, intelligent than people. And we have to be really alert now to seeing that many of the giant industries are now no longer trying to get the cheapest labor wherever they can. They're happy. There are corporations going back to America now to produce food in high-rise techno monocultures using AI and high technology. They're happy to go back to produce washing machines using robots. And with this use of robots, it is our job now to look at what those robots need. They need water, they need resources, they need us to go to Mars to fight over minerals. They need us to use our military to try to fight over minerals in the deep sea bed. We're talking about a rape of the earth and a dumping of people on a major, major scale. So please look at this issue now of how high technology linked to a financial casino is driving this change. Now, to come to the presentations that you made, you know, whether you're talking about what's been happening in China, well, for instance, in China, I would love people now to be looking at the extent to which the pollution and the damage in China has actually been created by foreign corporations producing for the rest of the world. To what extent that has now ended up creating so many of the problems that you see. But when you do that, you must please also keep in mind that replacing this with robots has an even bigger cost than the previous global local. And then, you know, when we're talking about the same in South Korea, let's please look at how these climate negotiations have been essentially shaped by big global corporations. The big global corporations have set the agenda for the framing of the climate issue. They came up with the idea of carbon to reduce this complex, very centrally important issue to a tradable commodity. And net zero is not what we think it is. Net zero has been created in a way that allows big business to simply offset or to use technologies to supposedly remove carbon. It enables accumulation of wealth through the carbon language and everything associated with it. Again, it's not evil people. I met Al Gore myself. I knew Morris Strong, who organized the meeting in Rio, which was sort of the beginning of big business shaping the environmental agenda. And I spent a lot of time in both South Korea and in Japan, where also not so much time, but I've been to China a few times, and I just see wonderful people with huge intelligence and a lot of motivation to deal with these issues. And in Japan, I just want to mention too, that when you're looking at urban agriculture, I want people to be aware that for big business, urban agriculture is an okay focus because it doesn't deal with the problem of mass urbanization as a consequence of corporate globalization and now techno corporatization. We are being pushed into big cities, and there we can talk a bit about agriculture, but we're not looking at what's happening to our farmers. We're not looking at the fact that urbanization is fundamentally part of a way of driving up resource use, creating inefficient agriculture using lots of technology, lots of chemicals. Now that's being replaced by robots and genetic modification, but it is still denying the truth, which I know in Japan, there are many people showing that if we allowed small farms to diversify, we could produce far more food per acre of food per unit of land. We need to be encouraging a type of ruralization, a balance between city and country, not everybody living on an acre of land, not everybody being a farmer, but a balance. And yeah, those are my comments and my sort of questions. And I guess if there are questions for me, we're ready for that now, are we?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Helena. I really appreciate the insights you shared. I am very sorry, but audience, I don't think we have time to ask questions to speakers and also hear your opinions on our topics because of the time limits. So but I still want to thank to the audience who has shown their interest in this topic a lot. So I'm a lot encouraged to initiate kind of knowledge platform among us to dig deeper into this topic with you so that we together create environmentally and socially just solutions that fit Asian local context and achieve net zero society better for all. So please be connected And with that, I think I need to close the session. Thank you to all the speakers once again, and to those attended until the end, and to interpreters up there, and to IJAP secretariats. See you in all other sessions. We still have other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, So Young. Great
Thank
to
you
be
very
here.
much.
Thanks.